Whereas there are no exceptions when it comes to the COVID-19 virus having a devastating effect on the people and the economies of the world, for one continent, Europe, the prospect of individual nations entering a second lockdown will create a heavy burden on the governments of each country, as well as the EU, to pick up the pieces left over from shattered economies. However, recent reports that a vaccination may be on the table could come as too little too late, even if the drug is rolled out in December, as promised, as the damage has already been done. Now in the UK, for example, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer has stated that the virus is too far along the second wave to be stopped this time around.
Frankly, we're in the middle of the second wave, and I don't see the vaccine making any difference for the wave we are now in. I'm hopeful that it may prevent future waves, but this one we have to battle through to the end without vaccine.
But what about the people of Europe? How are they reacting to the notion of a second lockdown happening? Is the prospect of facing tougher economic hardships ahead, or have lessons been learned from the previous wave of the virus that hit so hard? Just what worries the people?
La plupart des gens, je pense que la plupart des gens pensent comme moi en fait, qu'on n'a pas cette impression d'enfermement peut-être plus sévère que la première fois. Donc non, moi je n'ai pas beaucoup d'espoir quant à ce confinement-là. Je pense que j'ai même peur qu'il y ait des restrictions beaucoup plus drastiques qui viennent et assez rapidement, parce que je ne vois pas de prise de conscience cette fois-ci. La première fois, j'ai l'impression que les gens avaient beaucoup plus peur.
Hello and welcome to Economic Divide with me, Kabatapwe. First up, I'd like to say a big thank you to Omid Rochandel, who stood in for me for a few episodes whilst I covered the US elections. I'm sure you'll agree he did a great job. Well, in this week's episode, we will be looking at the economic impact of a second lockdown across Europe and how certain nations are dealing with the prospect. Don't forget, we always want to hear from you, so why not drop us an email at economicdivide@presstv.com or follow us on Twitter using the marker @ED_program. We look forward to hearing from you. Well, it seems that there are three main issues when it comes to dealing with the notion of a second lockdown across major towns and cities across Europe. The first is the most startling, namely the lack of government preparation. Although all have been through it once, it seems that major infrastructures are still not ready for a second wave, with schools, universities, and hospitals all left in the dark as to what may happen. Secondly, there's the real problem of having a weakened economy to deal with the virus. During the first wave, major European economies took a hit, with the likes of the UK seeing the worst hit, with a 25% drop in their GDP. The rest of Europe saw an overall decline of around 9 to 12% on average, hence a second wave will mean less spending power in fighting the virus than first time around. And finally, there's the notion of European unrest. That's right, unrest is happening because the center is not holding, with extreme polls emerging over the handling of the virus. Already most major European nations have seen protests against the measures being taken by governments. For businesses alone, the EU has already forked out 540 billion euros. But can it, A, afford another such bailout, and B, will the people of Europe be expected to pay the sum back in taxes? Challenging questions, I'm sure you'll agree.
France, much like the rest of Europe, has been no stranger to the devastating impact caused by the coronavirus, with the country seeing 1.92 million people infected and over 43,000 deaths at the time of writing, a number that will no doubt rise as the second wave of the pandemic sweeps across Europe. France was one of the first few nations in Europe to enter a lockdown at the start of the year, with the economic costs on the country costing billions of euros as bars, restaurants, leisure facilities and more closed down, putting at risk 15% of the total 220,000 registered hospitality companies in the country at a risk of closing permanently, which in turn will of course cost hundreds of thousands of jobs, with France 24 News stating that the figures may be as high as 250,000 people. The French government has tried to assist by providing various sources of economic assistance, with small businesses, such as cafes, being able to apply for solidarity grants of up to €10,000. There's also a furlough scheme which offers up to 100% of salaries, planned up to the end of December, as well as a series of government-backed loans. But to date, the cost of the virus has set back the French GDP by 13.8%, a figure that puts a dent in the side of Macron's budget. But as the second wave does its damage, the French government have realised that there's no choice but to introduce a full second lockdown, something that the French Prime Minister, Jean Castex, has stated will initially last 15 days, but could increase.
Avec le président de la République, nous avons donc décidé ce matin de maintenir inchangées, au moins pour les 15 prochains jours, les règles du confinement. Les commerces fermés au titre du confinement le resteront donc encore pour 15 jours supplémentaires.
For France, the harsh reality of a recession is on the cards, as the second lockdown will no doubt be a painful event through the cold winter months, and is something that the UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, has warned may be a factor for all nations to consider.
How then has the EU, as a supranational entity, dealt with the COVID-19 virus on a financial scale? There is no doubt that, much like the United States, the European Central Reserves have had to take immediate action to fund some of the most under-pressure institutions. For a start, €37 billion has had to be redirected from the budget to support struggling healthcare systems, small and medium-sized businesses, and labor markets via a scheme called the Coronavirus Investment Initiative. Add to this a further €28 billion designed to be distributed to structural funds. Now, this is primarily designed to tackle major crisis response situations across the EU, which, according to the EU Commission, includes grants towards regional development, social funds, cohesion funds, agriculture, maritime, and fisheries. Furthermore, up to €800 million has been redirected from the EU Solidarity Fund, directed at assisting the member states most severely hit by the virus. This is also part of the adaptation on EU rules set by Brussels, which will allow member states to transfer money between funds to meet their needs, showing at least just how flexible the EU has been in dealing with the virus.
One of the worst hit nations in terms of figures and the economy at the hands of the COVID-19 virus is Britain. Again, at the time of writing, the nation has seen 1.32 million infections, with a daily infection rate of over 27,000 people per day appearing to be the norm in the second wave, and so far has tragically seen over 51,000 people lose their lives to the virus. However, it's the economic impact of the virus that's hit Britain harder than some. In fact, with the country seeing the biggest hit to its GDP compared to other leading global economies, with the country seeing a brutal reduction of around 25%, something that, along with Brexit, has essentially brought the UK Treasury to its knees. One of the biggest hit industries in Britain is the retail and leisure sector, with the second lockdown once again causing bars, restaurants, cafes and cinemas to break into a very cold sweat that will no doubt leave many business owners facing a very uncomfortable Christmas ahead and an even worse New Year as Britain comes crashing out of the EU.
It's the small businesses, the high street businesses, the one-man bands that are most at risk from this second lockdown, and that is why it's vitally important that government supports these businesses so that they are still there when we come out of this at the beginning of next year. I'm not talking next month, I'm talking about the beginning of next year.
In an attempt to help the people, the UK government had introduced a furlough scheme which offered to pay up to 80% of salaries, up to £1,800. However, so far, the scheme has cost the UK taxpayer around £30 billion and is something that, as the number of people out of work or seeing their place of work go into lockdown rises, could be a major problem for the British government, who just last week saw its two closest advisors jump from Downing Street before they were pushed. All hopes now lie on a vaccine being found in time, and for the British, sooner rather than later, as the deadline for a deal with the EU fast approaches and the UK sees themselves floating ever further away from their one-time friends around the world. But even the hopes of a vaccine appear to be as distant as a trade deal with the EU and the rest of the world for the British.
I think it's one of the reasons why we have to we had great news this last week or so on vaccines, on the mass testing program. But I think it's one of the reasons we have to sort of curb our enthusiasm for the moment whilst we wait for those schemes to get wide enough that we can kind of present the double whammy to the virus of hitting it both with mass testing and with a vaccine.
Well, I'm pleased to say that joining me in the studio today is Rafael Leal-Arcas, a professor of European and International Law from Queen Mary University in London, and holds the first ever Jean Monnet Chair in EU International Law in the UK. He's authored numerous books and articles and has served as a Marie Curie Kofod Senior Research Fellow at the World Trade Institute. Professor Leal-Arcas, welcome to Economic Divide. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me here.
So, Professor, the first question. The COVID-19 virus already seen the majority of Europe fall into a lockdown earlier this year. And with the second wave now creating a similar situation, what do you think this spells in general for the EU's economy? Will the stronger together approach pull the EU through this once again?
Well, I don't think another lockdown is necessary if we take the correct precautionary measures. I actually worry that depending on how long this new lockdown will last, it may have very serious negative effects on the European economy. And I actually worry particularly for young people and those people who are working in services such as hotels, restaurants, bars, cinemas, and theaters. So we need to avoid the great economic paralysis.
Now, you have argued that lockdowns are not necessarily needed to control the virus if the corrective preventive measures are actually taken, stating that by trying to solve a clinical or health crisis, we're creating a much bigger macroeconomic crisis. Do you think that the EU can work together to actually prevent such an issue?
I actually think that the EU and the whole of the West, for that matter, has much to learn from the Far East. Thinking about countries such as China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, which have actually handled the COVID crisis very, very effectively. And let me give you an example. Taiwan has a population similar to that of the state of New York, around 20 million people, yet only 7 deaths have been reported as a result of COVID-19 in the case of Taiwan. Now compare that number with more than 33,000 deaths in the case of the state of New York. So I think the EU collectively should get its act together and learn from the experience of the Far East.
And finally, one of the main sectors affected by the pandemic is the hotel, catering, and leisure industries. I'm sure you'll agree, which many people employed are living on minimum wages and barely getting by. What is needed to A, protect these workers, and B, to ensure that these sectors are brought back up to speed as soon as possible?
Well, I don't think the solution is lockdown. Instead, all we need is 3 things. First, physical distancing. Second, wearing masks. And third, washing our hands frequently. If we do this, I would argue that 99% of the problem is solved. So we have a preventive and precautionary approach to COVID. There's no need for a lockdown. And that means that thousands of people will not need to lose their jobs. So the bottom line is that it all depends on our behavior.
Okay, thank you for that, Professor Rafael Leal-Arcas from Queen Mary University in London. It was great to have you on the show.
It's been my pleasure.
Great, thank you. Now, if you would like to find out more about Professor Leal-Arcas' work, be sure to check out his latest publications on your screens now. Now, don't go anywhere as we are about to take a short break here on Economic Divide. But before we go, here is what is coming up in the next part of the show. We're joined by our regular current affairs and impact analyst Mohan Abedin as he takes us through some of the stories making waves on social media. We'll also take a look at how the impact of the virus is taking its toll on Europe's largest economy, Germany. We'll also examine how the economic situation will play out across the rest of Europe. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this short message. Now, in this next report, let's take a look at how Germany, Europe's largest economy, is dealing with the second wave of the virus and the prospect of a second lockdown.
The largest economy in Europe, Germany, has for its size and population dealt rather well with the virus when it comes to containing it compared to some of its European neighbours. With a total of 785,000 recorded infections so far and only around 12,400 deaths, which although bad, is a fraction of the likes of France and Britain, is something that the Germans have clearly managed very well. The first lockdown and major wave of the virus saw the German economy sink around 10% initially, mostly due to a closure in heavy manufacturing and industrial plants. The sink was the sharpest fall in the German GDP since 1970. The second wave of the virus has brought German Chancellor Angela Merkel no choice but to bring the nation into a second lockdown. However, they are not as far-reaching as those in France and Britain, but once again sees restaurants, bars and gyms all feeling the brunt of the measures. But as cold weather fast approaches, the reality is that German hospitals must brace themselves for the impact of the virus during the cold German winter, meaning that medical facilities may soon find themselves overwhelmed with patients and demand as the cases rise faster.
Wir müssen uns darauf einstellen, dass sich die Situation in den kommenden Wochen verschärft. Manche Kliniken könnten an ihre Grenzen kommen. Es ist möglich, dass Patienten nicht mehr überall optimal versorgt werden können. Wir müssen daher verhindern, dass sich die Situation weiter zuspitzt. Das ist meine Erwartung und wir tun alles dafür, was in unserer Macht steht, um dieses Ziel zu erreichen.
But much like other major countries in Europe, the impact of the virus is beginning to take its toll on the people, with protests against the lockdown and the tough conditions ahead being more regular, which not only raise their point to the German government, but in a double-edged sword effect, risk spreading the virus further as groups congregate to protest. What now remains to be seen is whether the economic impact of the virus across Europe is something that can be recovered once the vaccinations come into place, which for Germany, as the major power in Europe, could once again see it becoming the economic backbone in rebuilding EU member states, a job and burden that may one day tire the Germans.
Time now to bring in Mahan Abedin. He's our current affairs and impact analyst. Mahan, welcome. Tell us what you have for us today.
Right, so, COVID deaths throughout Europe. First tweet will start with the UK. Highest death toll, 50,000 plus. The British government coming under increasing pressure for public health reasons. They haven't been able to save lives, but also equally important, they haven't been able to save the economy. So, and this is a big issue.
What about the way that this tweet has said, this isn't about public health versus the economy? The UK has failed to protect both. Do you agree?
Yes, broadly speaking, because they had a harsh lockdown in the spring and everybody knew come autumn there's going to be another so-called second wave, and they didn't take the appropriate measures. They went for a 3 or 4 tier system. That didn't work. So they've now gone for a second lockdown, albeit slightly softer than the first. But still, their cases are spiraling. And of course, you have the issue of Brexit negotiations, post-trade negotiations with the EU, a lot of uncertainty. And that's one reason I think that the British government now is reluctant to completely close down the economy.
Let's move on to the next post that you picked.
Yeah, so Germany, the continent's biggest economy, huge population, they've had markedly lower deaths than the UK, and yet they've taken, appropriate measures to keep it down. But listen, this is all about balancing, isn't it? It's balancing public health.
Well, this particular one took a jab at the UK.
Yes.
While talking about Germany.
Exactly. But look, but the point is, it's about balancing. You balance public health with the economy. And every country is different. So in Germany, a particular set of circumstances have allowed them to keep these figures low. Now, of course, in Britain, there are plenty of critics who say, look, the Germans, they've kept the deaths very low. How come ours are very high? A lot of stuff going on here, but let's not forget Britain, on the one hand, it's had, very high deaths, but on the other, is reluctant to, as I said, to close the economy because of all the uncertainty. Brexit is one. Another one is the election of Joe Biden as vice president. He's actually, unlike Trump, he's very pro-Brexit, and he doesn't like the way the UK is negotiating with the Europeans.
Biden doesn't?
Yeah, for a
Really?
For a post-Brexit trade deal, because the transition period expires on the 31st of December, so the UK and EU need to have a trade agreement in place by then.
Okay.
Yeah.
Final tweet, let's take a look at that.
Yeah, so second wave revolt, I think this is pushing it a bit. A revolt, I mean, what do you mean by revolt?
Well, what happened in Italy? In Naples, I believe it was?
There are protests against lockdown.
And you just had it in Germany, I think, a day or two ago.
Yes, but that's not a revolt, it's a protest. And I think, yeah, protests will continue, but the Europeans, I believe, actually have a handle on this. They've handled it better than
What would
the
it take
UK.
for a revolt, do you think?
What do you mean by revolt?
Revolt go against the government. You're not doing anything. They want money. In other words, they need stimulus plans, they need relief plans that are not happening, even though they've been promised.
All of them have had. The UK had a stimulus plan, the so-called furlough system to save jobs, and the UK Chancellor actually injected £200 billion into the economy.
Or is that going to be perpetual?
I go back to what I said earlier. It's a balancing act. So you have to protect public health on the one hand, and on the other, you have to protect the economy. Okay. So it's a difficult balance to strike.
Yeah, it's difficult all around when you're dealing with a pandemic of this magnitude. Thank you so much. We appreciate that. Mon Ahmadine, our current affairs and impact analyst. Thank you for his thoughts. Now, in our final report of the show, we will take a look at the wider spectrum across the EU and ascertain how some of the smaller nations in the bloc are dealing with the economic impact of the coronavirus.
With 27 member states, the EU is a strong entity, having proved this when certain member states began to struggle during previous financial crises. But how then are other states in the bloc faring when it comes to the virus? For one, Italy, as a nation which saw the worst impact of the first wave, is once again on the verge of tipping point. Protests and discontent at lockdowns and the handling of the virus have become commonplace in the Republic. And with tensions flaring, worse could yet still to come for the Italians as the virus rides a wave again across the nation. Spain, another country that saw terrible personal and economic costs caused by the virus, is no different from Italy, with the Spanish economy taking an 18.5% knock on the head during the first wave, and is likely to see a similar or worse slump as winter approaches, with much of the nation's income depending on tourism and alfresco living. Much like Germany, Italy and the UK, people have also taken to the streets in protests at the handling of the virus and the impact it's having.
La situación es absolutamente lamentable. Es inexplicable todo lo que está pasando cuando en otros sectores hay más contagios que en el sector de los bares y encima nos han demonizado, no nos ayuda nadie y nos están dejando morir, pero por la cara, vamos, sin solución.
For some of the less well-off nations in Europe, dealing with the virus has also been a major challenge, with many nations in Eastern Europe feeling they're not as included in the EU compared to Western European states, meaning that the virus appears to have been largely ignored in comparison to other states, certainly at least on a publicity level. For southern nations in Europe, and in particular Greece, which is already struggling financially, the impact of the virus is also having a devastating effect.
Νομίζω ότι τα νοσοκομεία και το σύστημα είναι ήδη στο όριό του σε αυτό το κύμα και πραγματικά ανησυχώ πάρα πολύ για την εξέλιξη. Νομίζω ότι τα αριθμητικά δεδομένα είναι πάρα πολύ ανησυχητικά.
All hope now lies with the rapid and successful introduction, distribution and implementation of an effective and long-lasting vaccine, something that appears to be on the horizon as Pfizer and BioNTech approach the final stages of their research, giving hope to over 350 million people around Europe and, of course, the rest of the population around the world.
The impact of the coronavirus has no doubt left families devastated at the horrific consequences of the virus, with over 52 million people infected and counting, and around 1.3 million deaths worldwide so far. Yet for Europe, the challenges that lie ahead are truly worrying. For a start, the bloc will soon see its first member leave the Union in January, as Britain cuts its final ties and Brexit becomes a reality. This could, in theory, spark other nations to do the same, leaving the European Union in jeopardy. But as the EU comes to terms with the arrival of the second wave of the virus, could this also be the catalyst that brings the EU even closer together, as the bloc pulls together as pillars of unity and financial power to tackle one of the most devastating events in recent human history? But one thing is for sure, that until the vaccine arrives, the EU will be looking to cement the notion of being stronger together in the process, sharing its technology, scientific research, and common knowledge along the way. Don't forget, You can watch this episode again anytime by logging onto our website and clicking on shows. You can also write into us at economicdivide@pressthebeat.com to share your thoughts and views. And that's about all the time we have for this week's show. I've been Kavit Atway on behalf of myself and the whole team here on Economic Divide. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and see you again next time.